If a person cared to be fair about it, and few ever do, none of what came after was Wenna's fault. She had carried a jug and kept her eyes down, which is no crime in any land under the moon. The blame belonged to a king too proud to be governed and too pleased with his own cleverness to see where it would take him. The great hall of Carstall had heard a great many arguments in its long life, but rarely one so politely vicious as this. "You will take a queen by the first frost," said Councillor Bracken, folding his old hands as though he were doing his king a favor. "The pack requires it. Pharaohmark requires it. Lady Isan is willing, well-born, and strong in the blood. The match is made in all but name." Alaron, king of Rimewood, sat with one boot hooked over the arm of his father's heavy chair, and gave every appearance of not listening. He was young for the weight he carried, and he wore it the way a man wears a coat he has not yet decided he likes. Around the long table the elders watched him the way farmers watch a sky that has not made up its mind. "Willing," Alaron said. "How very generous of her." "Your Grace," Bracken's voice thinned. "This is not a courtship. It is an alliance. Pharaohmark holds the whole of the eastern run. Refuse the girl and you refuse her father's spears, and then you may explain to the pack why the border stood empty all through the winter." And there it was. Not a request at all. A collar, held out with a smile, and the whole council leaning in to watch it, buckled. Alaron let the quiet stretch until it grew uncomfortable, a trick his father had taught him, and very nearly the only useful thing the old king had left behind. "And if I should find I do not care for the lady?" he asked. "A king does not marry for caring," Bracken said. "He marries for the pack." "For the pack," Alaron repeated softly. "Everything is for the pack, so long as it is the very thing this council has already chosen for me." He had worn the crown 11 months. In 11 months he had learned that it was a heavy hat the men at this table meant to steer him by, and that when he refused them on some small matter they only smiled and waited, but that if he refused them on a queen, they would simply arrange one while he slept. Somewhere behind the king a servant moved along the wall, filling cups that no one had touched. Alaron had not looked at her once. He could not have told anyone afterward why he looked at her then. Perhaps only because the council wanted his eyes on Isan, and wanting a thing of him had lately become the surest way to make him do the opposite. The girl at the wall was nothing to look at, or so the hall would have told you. A plain brown dress, a plainer face, hair scraped back under a servant's cap, and a small dull pin of black iron at her collar. She filled a cup, set it down, and stepped back into the quiet that servants live in. The quiet that lets a person hear everything and be seen by no one. She had lived inside that quiet so long she had stopped noticing it herself, the way a fish forgets the water it swims in. It had kept her safe. It had kept her fed. In 16 years it had never once put her in the way of any danger worth the name, which only goes to show how little safety is worth on the evening a bored king decides to look up. "By the first frost," Bracken said again, mistaking the silence for surrender. "By the first frost," Alaron agreed and rose to his feet. "I will be married. You have my word on it, before all of you, so that no one here can ever say I broke it." The relief around the table was immediate, and Alaron found the thought of ruining it deeply satisfying. "But not to Isan of Pharaohmark," he went on. "I will not be sold east like a bolt of cloth to settle a quarrel over grazing. I will choose my own queen from my own house, and I will choose her now, in front of every one of you, so the thing is done and cannot be argued away by morning." The hall went very still. He turned, unhurried, and let his gaze travel the whole length of the wall until it came to rest on the girl with the jug. "You," he said, "come here. What are you called?" The jug did not fall, which Wenna would later count as the single dignified thing she managed all that day. "Your name," the king said again, almost gently, as though they had the whole evening to themselves, and a hall packed with lords were not turning as one to stare at her. "Wenna, your grace?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt. 16 years of being invisible had at least taught her how to keep her face shut. "Wenna." He said it as if testing whether it would serve. "And what is it you do here, Wenna?" "I carry things. I scrub the lower kitchen. I keep the scent warden's stores for Mistress Hessa." A scullery girl. Bracken was on his feet now, all his careful courtesy gone. "Your Grace, this is madness wearing the coat of spite. You cannot set a kitchen maid over Ferromark. You cannot possibly mean it." "I mean it entirely." Alaran had not raised his voice, and that was the worst of it. "I swore I would take a queen of my own house by the first frost. Here she stands, unless you would like it set down in ink and witnessed." Across the hall, where the envoys of Ferromark sat in their traveling silks, a woman stood up. Lady Isan was everything Wenna was not, tall and gold and certain, with the flat, pale eyes of an alpha who had never once in her life been refused. She did not shout. Women like Isan have never needed to. "You will regret this, Alaran," she said, and her voice carried like cold water going down a stair. "My father will hear exactly how Rimewood prizes his friendship. A kitchen girl. You have made a fool of us both tonight." "I have made a queen," said the king. "The only foolish part is how little effort it took to unmake your engagement." It ought to have frightened Wenna a great deal more than it did. Most of her had drifted off somewhere near the rafters and was watching the whole scene from above, quite certain that at any moment someone would laugh, and the dream would fold itself away. No one laughed. They did not wait. Alaran seemed to understand, as Wenna did not yet, that a thing left standing overnight can be talked to pieces by dawn, and so he would leave nothing standing overnight. The packrite was old and short. A cord of grey wool was wound wrist over wrist. Words in the elder tongue that Wenna felt more than followed, warm and heavy and final, closed over the two of them like a door swinging shut. When it was finished, the king let go of her hand as courteously as he had first taken it, and the hall of Karstall had itself a queen it had never once asked for. Hessa caught her in the corridor afterward, and for the first time in all the years Wenna had known her, the old scent warden looked afraid. "What have you done?" Hessa breathed, gripping her by both arms. "What did you let him do?" "I did not let him. I could not have stopped it, Hessa. He simply pointed and it was done. I never said one word." "Listen to me now." The old woman's fingers flew to the small black pin at Wenna's collar, the pin she had fastened there when Wenna was a child far too young to remember. The pin Wenna had been forbidden always, on pain of every punishment Hessa could put a name to, ever to take off. Hessa pressed it hard against the hollow of her throat as though she meant to drive it into the bone. "Whatever comes of this, whatever that man asks of you, you do not remove this, not to sleep, not to wash, not for him. Do you hear me, girl? If it ever leaves your throat, there will be no hiding what you are." "What I am," Wenna said. "Hessa, what am I?" But the old woman had already gone gray and closed, the way she always did when a question wandered too near to something long buried, and she would say nothing more. They gave her rooms that night grander than any she had ever cleaned, and then they left her in the middle of them like a parcel no one was quite sure how to address. Wenna sat on the edge of a bed wide enough for a whole family, and listened to the strange, deep quiet of a place where no one would be shouting for her before dawn. She was still in her servant's dress. It had not occurred to anyone to bring her another, and it had certainly not occurred to her to ask for one. She knew what a wedding night was. She had carried enough linen and overheard enough laundry talk to know exactly what a lord expected of the woman he had bound himself to, and so she sat with her hands folded hard in her lap and watched the door and tried, with only middling success, not to be sick. The room did not help. Everything in it was too large and too soft and far too clean. made for a body that had never once knelt to scrub a floor, and Wenna sat in the middle of all that borrowed comfort feeling more like a thief than a bride. She kept waiting for a steward to come and tell her there had been a mistake, that the king had recovered his wits, that the lower kitchen wanted its girl back before the morning bread. No one came. The candles burned low. The great house settled around her, its old stone ticking as it cooled, and still she waited. When the knock finally came, it undid her more than a shout would have, because lords do not knock on doors. "May I come in?" said the King of Rhymewood through his own door. She could think of no answer that a queen was supposed to give, so she gave the true one. "It is your house, your grace?" He came in and he sat in a chair a careful distance from her, and he did not reach for her at all. In the low firelight he looked younger and a great deal more tired than he had in the hall, as though the performance had cost him something he was only now counting. "I owe you the truth, since I have spent your whole life for you in an evening," he said. "This marriage is a blow aimed at my counsel, not at you. I have no wish to touch you, and I will not. What I need from you is only the look of a queen through the winter, until my seat is steady under me. Give me that, and when the frost breaks you may name your price. Coin, your freedom. A house so far from Carsthal that none of these lords will ever trouble you again. I am not a cruel man, whatever you heard tonight. I am only a cornered one." Wenna had braced herself for so many worse things that his plain courtesy left her with nowhere to put her hands. "Why me?" she managed. "There were 40 servants in that hall you might have shamed them with." "Because you were the last thing they expected me to reach for," he said simply. "And because you did not flinch when I did. That will matter. In the days coming. They will try to prove this marriage a sham and have it set aside. And Isan will help them do it out of spite of her own. Give them nothing they can use, not a word out of place, not a door left open. Can you do that?" "I have gone unnoticed my whole life, Your Grace," she said. "I can do it in my sleep." Something crossed his face that might, in a warmer man, have become a smile. He rose to go. And then, near the door, he stopped. The fire had shifted, or a draught had come under the sill, or some small thing had stirred the still air of the room, and on it there came to him a thread of scent so faint he might have dreamed it. It was nothing a plain iron pin and a plainer brown dress had any business carrying. It was low and bright and impossibly clean, and it reached straight past every careful, courteous thought in the king's head and laid a hand on the wolf beneath, and the wolf lifted its head and did not know why. Alaron went very still. He turned back and looked at the small, silent woman on the edge of the enormous bed as though he had never seen her before in his life, as though the whole hall and all its lords had shown him a maid and left out something enormous, and for one long breath he almost spoke. Then he mastered it, whatever it was, and made himself walk out, and the door closed behind him. Wenna sat alone in the firelight with her heart going far too fast. She had done nothing. She had said almost nothing. And yet the King of Rhymewood had looked back at her, at the last, as though she were not invisible at all. It frightened her far more than his courtesy had. The trouble with being a secret, Wenna would understand a long while later, is that a person cannot know she is one. She woke on her first morning as Queen of Rhymewood to find that the palace had decided, overnight, that it no longer knew what she was either. The maids who had ordered her about the lower kitchen a day before now stood in the doorway of her grand new rooms and could not decide whether to bob or to scold. A footman carried in her breakfast and set the tray down as though it might bite him. No one would meet her eyes, and no one thought to tell her what a queen was meant to do with a morning that had no floors in it to scrub, so she sat very straight in a borrowed robe with her hands folded in her lap and waited, which was the one skill she had carried out of the old life into the new. It was Pell who saved her from it. Pell had washed linen at her side for 3 years, A round and cheerful girl with red hands and no sense of occasion at all, and she came in without knocking, took one look at the Queen of Rhymewood sitting stiff as a fence post, and laughed out loud. "Oh, stop that," Pell said. "It is only me. You look like a woman waiting to be hanged." "I may yet be," Wenna said, and found to her own surprise that she could smile about it. Pell dropped onto the edge of the enormous bed without being asked, which not one other soul in the whole palace would have dared, and it was the first warm thing that had happened to Wenna since a king pointed at her across a crowded hall, and it loosened some small knot in her chest that she had not known was tied. "They are all terrified of you, you know," Pell went on, picking a grape from the untouched tray. "Cook will not say your name out loud. Old Bemis swears you mean to have us whipped for the time we short-sheeted the under-butler." She grinned. "I told them you could not whip a cushion. Was that wrong of me?" "No," said Wenna. "It is the truest thing anyone has said in this room all morning." The steward found the two of them there an hour later. Garrick was a long, gray, careful man who had served 3 kings and plainly considered the present one a personal trial, and he addressed Wenna with a stiff courtesy that visibly cost him something. "Your Grace," he said, "you had best know how the ground lies. The council has laid a challenge against the marriage before the elder court. They mean to argue that a binding unwanted with no true bond behind it is no binding at all, and to have it struck from the rolls under the old law." He paused, choosing the next words with care. "Lady Isan has not gone home to Ferromark. She has taken apartments in the East Wing, and she means to stay until the matter is settled." Wenna's mouth had gone dry. "Struck from the rolls," she said. "And what becomes of me then?" "That," said Garrick, "is not a question anyone above stairs has trouble to ask." She was still turning that over when the king came. He came as he had before, without ceremony, and he stopped in the middle of her rooms as though he had forgotten halfway there why he had wanted them. He spoke of the challenge, of the need to be seen as man and wife, of walks in the garden and shared meals and all the small public untruths a marriage under suspicion is obliged to tell. His words were brisk and cool and perfectly sensible. And the whole time he spoke, some part of him was not listening to his own mouth at all. Alaron could not have told anyone what was wrong with the room. It was warm. It was quiet. And underneath the ordinary smells of wood smoke and beeswax and clean linen, there ran a single thread of something that had no business being there, low and bright and impossible to put a name to, and it pulled at him the way a scent carried on the wind pulls at a hunting wolf, so that he lost the sense of his own sentence twice over and had to hunt it down again, and grew quietly furious with himself each time. Twice she caught him looking at her, not at her face, but at her throat, at the small dull pin she wore there, with the narrow attention of a man trying to place where he has seen a thing before. Each time she went cold and turned the pin under her collar with 2 fingers, and each time his gaze slid away again, unsatisfied, as though the answer had been on the very tip of his tongue and had then slipped off it. He stayed far longer than he had meant to. Going back down the cold stair, he told himself it had been the weight of the challenge that kept him. He was a clever man, and he very nearly believed it. So began the strangest season of Wenna's life. They walked out together each morning, because the garden was where the court could watch them and the challenge demanded an audience. Alaron would offer his arm at the door with a face like a shut gate, and they would go out along the frost-rimed paths, past lords who bowed low and whispered lower, and for a quarter of an hour they would perform a marriage that neither of them had chosen. Wenna told herself every single morning exactly what it was. She had been useful and invisible her whole life, and a plain girl learns very young that when a great person turns to look at her, it is because something wants carrying, or cleaning, or keeping quiet. That was all this was. She was a wall that had been asked, for one winter, to stand where a queen should stand. She would not be fool enough to mistake being needed for being wanted. She had watched cleverer women than herself make that mistake and weep for it in the scullery afterward. The difficulty was that the king would not keep to his part. He began, on those walks, to talk to her, and worse, to listen. He asked her things no one had asked her in her life, and when she answered plainly, because plainness was the only speech she owned, he did not laugh, and he did not look away. She told him what the servants would never tell him, which passages leaked, which understeward stole, which of his bowing lords went pale when his back was turned. She told him the truth, and a king drowning in flattery found that he was thirsty for it. "You see the whole house," he said to her one gray morning, sounding almost bewildered. "You have seen it all along from underneath, while the rest of us stood at the top and saw nothing." "No one hides from the person who empties the grates," she said. "You learn a palace quickly when it does not know you are there." He looked at her for a long moment then, not as a king looks at a servant, and not as a man looks at a piece on a board, but simply as one person looks at another, they have just discovered is real, and something in Wenna that had been braced for years to be set down and forgotten, cracked very slightly, and let in a thin and dangerous light. "You are not what they told me you would be," he said, half to himself. "And what was that, your grace?" "A convenience." He seemed to hear the word only as it left him, and something in his face closed over, as though he had laid down a card he had meant to keep hidden. He looked away across the frostbitten hedges. "Nothing. Forget I said it." But she did not forget it. She turned it over the whole of that day, the way the tongue worries a loose tooth, unable to leave the strange sweet ache of it alone. She caught herself. She always caught herself. But it was getting harder. And all the while the other thing was growing. She felt it worst when he stood close. The little black pin at her throat, cold as river iron her whole life, had begun to warm against her skin when the king was near, and once, on the path, as his sleeve brushed hers, it went hot as a coal, and a wave of something rolled off her that she could not see and could not stop. A young guard at the garden wall went rigid where he stood. His head came round. He took one helpless step toward her, and then another. His face gone slack and strange, before he caught himself against the stone, white and shaking, and stared at his own boots as though they had betrayed him. Alaran saw the guard. He felt his own wolf lunge and strain against its chain for no reason he could name, and he stopped on the path with his jaw tight and his eyes narrow, and Wenna watched him understand that something was happening, and not know what, and she was afraid. He said nothing of it on the walk back. But that evening a question reached her through Garrick, put with a steward's careful blankness, whether her grace had ever, in her years below stairs, been treated by the scent warden for any ailment of the blood. Wenna said no. She was not certain it was a lie. That was the worst of it. She did not know. That night Hesse came and took the pin between her old fingers and turned it to the candlelight, and her face fell away into fear. "It is thinning," the scent warden whispered. "The iron is losing its bite. A little more of it goes each day you spend beside that man. Gods forgive me for ever letting him near you." She closed her fist around it. "I cannot mend it, child. Such a binding is laid once, upon a babe too young to have woken, and it can never be set fresh on a woman grown. I have watched this pin every day of your life for this one reason, and now I am an old woman watching it fail, and there is not a thing these two hands can do. When it gives way at last, it will not give way slowly. It will go all at once, in a single breath, and everything you are will be standing in the open for the whole world to see." "Then tell me what I am," Wenna begged. "Before it does. Hesse, please." But the old woman only pressed the pin back to her throat, and would not. For a few days the palace held its breath, and nothing happened, which is generally the way of things in the last quiet moment before everything does. Let us pause here a moment. If Wenna's story has its hooks in you, and you would like to be here when that little iron pin finally gives way, take a breath and subscribe before we go on. Wenna did what she had always done when she was afraid. She kept small. She kept to quiet corners and back stairs. She pressed the warm pin flat to her throat with 2 fingers whenever the king came near. And she counted the days to the elder court, the way a person counts the days to a tooth being pulled, wanting it over and dreading it equally. It was on such a corner, on such a back stair, that she met Lord Doran. He was a cousin of Isan, a great pale slab of a Pharaohmark alpha who had stayed on with her to help press the challenge, and he filled the narrow stair from wall to wall. He began exactly as she expected such a man to begin, with a slow and pleasant sneer. And then the thread of her reached him, and the sneer fell straight off his face. His nostrils flared. His pale eyes went black from the center out. Every ounce of the contempt drained out of him in a breath and left something dazed and helpless in its place, a great alpha lord swaying on the narrow stair as though he had forgotten his own name. He took one unsteady step toward her, and another, drawn, his hand rising toward her without his leave, as though some older command had taken his body clean out of his keeping. "What are you?" he breathed, and there was no sneer left anywhere in it, only a helplessness that frightened her more than his scorn ever had. She stepped back until her shoulder found the cold wall. A door opened somewhere below, and Garrick's dry voice called up the stair to ask whether her grace required anything, and the ordinary sound of it broke over Lord Doran like cold water. He wrenched himself backward a full pace, shaking, appalled at his own body, staring at the hand that had lifted without his asking. He looked at her once more, and there was fury in it now, and shame, and beneath both a fear that matched her own, and then he turned and went, fast, without another word. Wenna stayed pressed to the wall long after his boots had faded, her heart slamming, and understood at last, in her own body and not merely in Hessa's warnings, exactly what the old woman had spent a lifetime trying to hold shut. One stray thread of her, through a thinning pin, had unmade a lord in a corridor. She thought of the pin coming off all at once, in a breath, as Hessa had said it would. She thought of a hall full of alphas, and for the first time she was not afraid only for herself. Winter came down on Rimewood in earnest, and with it came the thing Wenna had feared most, which was not the cold and was not the elder court. It was that she was beginning to be happy. The walks were no longer a performance she endured. She caught herself waking early for the cold hour after breakfast, when the king would come to her door with his shut-gate face and offer his arm, because the shut gate was only ever for the court, and somewhere out along the frost paths it always opened. He told her things a king is not meant to tell anyone, the boarder he could not hold, the father whose great chair still did not fit him, the lords who smiled to his face and counted behind their hands the days until he failed. And she, who had spent a whole life being told nothing at all, found she had a great deal to say to a man who would finally sit still and listen. Only one door he would not open. Whenever she turned the talk toward the strange things, toward the guard who had swayed on the wall, toward the way his own breath changed when he stood too near her, toward the plain flat question of what a scullery girl could possibly be that would trouble a king, he would go smooth and light and turn the whole conversation so gently aside that she would be 3 subjects along before she understood the door had shut behind her. He was the most charming liar she had ever met, and she had grown up among servants who are the finest liars in any house. She had proof of it one evening in the library. He had bent over a border map with her, closer than was wise, tracing a road with one finger, and the pin at her throat went from warm to hot in the space of a breath, and something rolled off her that she could not see and could not call back. His hand closed hard over hers on the parchment. His head came round. For one long moment the careful king was simply gone, and what looked out of his pale eyes was old and wordless and hungry, and she felt the whole enormous weight of his attention settle on her like a hand at the back of her neck. Then he mastered it. He stood and put the width of the room between them and said in a rough voice that it was late. But she had seen. Whatever moved the guard on the wall moved the king of Rimewood too, and he was fighting it with every scrap of will he owned. And she did not know whether to be flattered or afraid, and settled, in the end, on both. She lay awake that night turning it over. All her life she had been wanted for what her hands could do, and here at last was a man who seemed to want her for the awkward truth of her company. If there was a heat under his courtesy that frightened her, she told herself that every good thing carries a shadow, and that a woman given so few good things had no business inspecting this one too closely. It was the most dangerous lie she told the whole winter, and she told it to herself. And the pin only grew warmer. She wore it always now, 2 fingers pressed to it half the day, and still there were mornings its heat woke her. Still there were moments in a crowded corridor when a passing lord's head would turn as though he had heard his own name called from very far off. Hessa hovered and fretted and mixed bitter draughts that did nothing at all, and the short days ran down toward the first frost like water down a drain. For the elder court had set its day. On the night of the first true frost, the whole of the high pack would gather at Carstall for the old midwinter feast, and there, before every lord and every envoy, before Ferromark and the council both, the court would rule upon the challenge and decide whether the marriage stood or fell. "A hall full of them," Wenna said, when Garrick brought the word. "Every alpha in the high pack, all at once, in a single room." She did not have to say the rest. Garrick, who did not know the half of it, still went gray, because he had seen the guard on the wall. That night the king found her at the window, watching the hard, bright stars that meant the frost was near, and for once he did not deflect and did not charm. He came and stood beside her, and after a while, not looking at her, he said, "Whatever you are, Wenna, and I am beginning to think you are a very great deal, you have been the one honest hour of my day since they set a crown on my head. I would not undo it. Whatever the court rules, I want you to know that much is true. I would not undo it." It was not a declaration. It was far too careful for that. But it was the truest thing he had ever handed her, and she carried it down into sleep like a coal cupped in cold hands. She ought to have known better. A coal cupped too close always burns. The night of the first frost, Carstall blazed. Every sconce and every hearth had been lit, and the great hall that had heard Wenna sentenced to a crown now filled to its high beams with the whole high pack of Rimewood, lords in midwinter furs, the envoys of Ferromark in their travelling silks, with Isan cold and golden at their center. The 9 of the elder court on their raised bench, old and unreadable, and alphas everywhere, more of them under one roof than Wenna had stood near in the whole of her careful life, and every one of them a wall she must not let herself lean against. She came in on the king's arm in a gown the color of deep water, and she felt the pin burning quietly at her throat, and she smiled the way Alaron had taught her, and she prayed. The performance began as performance. He bent to say something meaningless in her ear so the court would see a husband dote. She laughed the way a wife laughs. They moved through the hall, trading the small coins of a marriage, and the whole time the elder court watched them with the flat patience of men who had come to take a thing apart. And then, somewhere in the middle of it, the performance forgot itself. He said something that was not for the court at all, low and dry and only for her, a joke about Bracken's hat, And she laughed for true, and he looked down at her laughing and forgot, for one whole breath, to arrange his face. And she saw the shut gate stand open in the middle of a crowded hall, saw him look at her the way he had looked in the library, but with no hunger in it now, only a kind of astonishment, as though he had set out to win an argument and won something else entirely and did not know what to do with it. For that one breath the frost and the court and the 9 watching elders all fell away, and there were only the 2 of them, a king and the maid he had married to, spite the world, standing in a blaze of light, having quite forgotten why. Someone had begun the old midwinter measures, the slow circling dance the high pack had turned at this feast for longer than anyone could remember, and because a doting husband would, Alaran drew her out onto the floor. He was a careful dancer, as he was a careful everything, and she had never danced a step in her life, and so she simply set her hand in his and let him move her. And for the length of one slow turn of the hall, she forgot to be afraid of the alphas at the walls, forgot the 9 cold elders on their bench, forgot even the pin at her throat. And there was only the warm hand at her waist and the astonished man attached to it, turning her under 1,000 candles as though there were all the time in the world and no court anywhere in it. It could not last. Bracken rose. The challenge was called. And the questioning began, meant to lay bare before the whole pack that this was no marriage but a boy king's tantrum dressed in a gown. Is there a true bond between them or only a binding of words? The eldest of the court asked. A mate bond cannot be counterfeited, and every nose in this hall would know one. That, said Alaran pleasantly, is between my wife and myself, and the frost. The law is not satisfied by wit, your grace. Then the law may go cold and hungry, for it will get no more from me. Or, said Isan, rising smooth and gold from among the Ferromark silks, the court might simply ask the girl. A true mate does not flinch to say so. Let her stand and tell this hall, in her own kitchen voice, that the king of Rimewood has ever once looked at her as a man looks at his wife. She smiled. We will all know, I think, by whether she can meet a single eye while she says it. Every head in the hall turned to Wenna. It was, she would think later, the cleverest cruelty anyone had worked on her yet. Because it was true, she could not have said it, and the silence stretched and stretched. It might have held. It might all have held on his nerve and her stillness, had the hall not been so full and so warm and so packed with alphas, and had the pin not chosen that hour, under all that strain, to reach the end of what the old failing iron could still do. Wenna felt it go. It did not go all at once, not yet. But it slipped, the way a foot slips on ice before the fall, and a wave of her rolled out across the crowded hall wider and brighter than anything the library or the corridor had ever seen. The nearest lords turned first, then those behind them. Heads came round all across the hall as though a bell only they could hear had rung. A low sound rose, dozens of throats at once, want and confusion together, and men who had come to watch a marriage torn apart began, without knowing why, to drift from their places toward the high table, toward her, their faces gone slack and strange and terribly young. Doran of Ferromark was on his feet with his pale eyes black. Even 2 of the 9 elders had risen from their bench. The great hall of Carstall, which had sentenced her once and had come tonight to sentence her again, was sliding in front of her eyes into something no law had a word for. 300 alphas forgetting rank and name and reason all at once, drawn by a thread not one of them could have described, and under the rising sound of it Wenna heard very clearly, somewhere behind her in the crowd, Hessa begin to laugh. The hall tipped, in that moment, toward something with no name and no bottom. And Alaran moved. He did not freeze and he did not gape, and some small cold part of Wenna would remember that later and wonder at it. He stepped in front of her, put his own body between her and the whole swaying hall, and threw his voice to the rafters in the full command of an alpha king, an order to hold, to stand, to be still, and the raw force of it broke over the room like cold water and stopped the drift half a pace short of ruin. In the same breath he had her by the hand and off the dais and out through the servants' door behind the high table, into the dark of the passage where she had once carried jugs, and he pulled the heavy door shut on the roaring hall and set his back against it. They stood there in the dark, both of them breathing hard. "You are shaking," he said. "You are not." She could barely get the words out. "Every man in that hall lost himself, and you got them back with a shout. And you were not surprised. You knew what to do. You knew exactly what to do." She stared up at his dim face in the passage dark. "How did you know what to do, Aileron?" For the length of a heartbeat he said nothing at all. Then he lifted his hand, slowly, and with the back of one finger he brushed a loose strand of hair from her damp forehead. And it was the first time he had touched her, and meant nothing by it but kindness, and it undid her more thoroughly than the hall had. "Because I have been afraid of it for weeks," he said quietly. "And a man prepares for the thing he fears." He let his hand fall. "Come, before they break that door down. We are not finished, you and I, but not here." She went with him. Of course she went with him. And she did not notice, in the heat and the fear and the wonder of that touch, that he had answered the smaller question and left the larger one exactly where it lay. She found it the next morning, and it was such an ordinary thing to find. The court had suspended its ruling in the chaos, which was as near to a victory as they could have hoped for, and Wenna had slept badly and risen early out of old habit, and gone looking in the king's study for the border maps he had promised to show her, meaning to surprise him by understanding them before he woke. She was not looking for anything else. That was the part she would come back to, afterward, again and again. She had only pulled open a drawer. It was a slim packet of papers, tied in a lawyer's ribbon, and it fell open in her hands before she understood what it was. An inquiry, commissioned in the king's own hand, dated the very week of the wedding. A quiet request, sent to a keeper of old records far in the south, for everything that could be found concerning a lost line, a line the papers named the Winterborn, the old queens of Rhymewood whose scent, the crabbed southern hand had written back, no alpha living or dead could refuse, hunted to the last child when the packs would no longer be ruled by a thing that could own them. And beneath that, in the king's hand again, a short cold list of instructions to Garrick. Watch her. Learn her habits. Learn what the old woman keeps at her throat. Above all, let no word of what she may be leave this house, and give me time to secure her before the council or Ferromark can. Secure her. Wenna sat down slowly on the cold floor of the study with the papers in her lap. She understood it all at once, the way the pin was one day going to go, all in a breath. He had known. Not for weeks, from the very start. He had reached across a hall and pointed at a scullery girl to spite his counsel. Yes, but somewhere in the first days he had caught the same thread on the air that had unmade Doran on a stair, and being a clever man, the cleverest she had ever met, he had gone quietly and found out exactly what he had married. And then he had set about doing what clever men do with a weapon that has fallen into their lap. He had made himself pleasant. He had learned her. He had let her believe, on frost paths in the cold hour after breakfast, that she was the one honest hour of his day, when all the while she had been the one thing in his kingdom worth securing. Every kind word, every open gate, every eye would not undo it. She turned each one over now in the gray light and saw the ledger behind it, and the small, dangerous light that had got into her chest all winter went out. She sat with it a long time, there on the cold floor, and let herself feel the whole shape of it. It was not even a new grief, and that was the worst of it. It was the oldest grief she owned, the one she had carried out of the scullery and up into the crown, only wearing a finer coat now. She had let herself believe, for one winter, that she had finally been seen. And she had been seen. She had been seen more clearly than by anyone in her whole life, seen all the way down to the rare and dangerous blood in her, and valued exactly and only for it. To be looked at that closely and wanted only for the use of it was somehow a colder thing than never being seen at all. You should not have read those. He stood in the study door. She had not heard him come. His face was the smooth, careful one, the one he wore for dukes and frightened councilmen, the one he had not once turned on her since the first week, and he was turning it on her now. No, she agreed. She got to her feet. Her legs held, which surprised her. I should not have. Then I would have gone on believing it. How long did you mean to let me, Alaron? Through the spring? Until you needed me pointed at Ferromark? A weapon does keep better if it thinks it is loved. Do not, he said, and something in the careful face cracked. Do not say that word as if I taught it to you. Yes, I found out what you were. I will not stand here and pretend the first days were anything but what they were. But it stopped being that, Wenna. It stopped being that so long ago I cannot even find the day it turned, and if you would only let me tell you. Let you tell me. She laughed, and it was an ugly sound she had never once heard herself make. That is the whole trick of it, is it not? You decide the day it turned. You decide what I am ready to know. You have been deciding what I am allowed to know about my own self since the first week of my life at this palace, and you would like to go on deciding it. Only kindly now. Only for my own good. She shook her head. I have had a lifetime of my own good. I am sick to death of it. You told no one. She had found the last page, a note in his own hand to himself, hard pressed into the paper. If it is known, they will either kill her for what her blood did to their grandfathers, or fight to the death over which of them holds her leash. It must not be known. Not to the council. Not to Ferromark. Not to her, until she is safe. You never told the council. You could have handed them a winterborn queen and named your price and been the most secure king in 5 generations, and you buried it instead. Even from me. Her voice broke on it, and she hated that it broke. Why? Because the moment you knew, he said, very low, you would look at me exactly the way you are looking at me now. And there it was, the one true thing, arriving far too late to save either of them, because he was right. And she was looking at him that way, and knowing he had guarded her secret at the cost of his own crown, did not undo the drawer, did not undo secure her, did not undo a whole winter of being the useful thing at a great person's side, which was the one wound she had carried her entire life, and the one he had promised, without ever saying so, that he would never be. You do not get to keep me safe by keeping me small, she said. Hesse did that for 16 years. I did not know it was a cage until I felt the walls. I will not walk into a second one because the man building it has kinder eyes. She set the papers on his desk, squared, the way a servant leaves a thing tidy, and she walked out of the study, and he did not follow, because he was clever enough at last to know it would not help. She got as far as the corridor before her legs remembered they were not certain of her, and she put one hand flat to the cold stone wall and stood a moment, and did not weep, because weeping was a thing a person did when she still expected comfort to come, and she had just that morning finished learning that she did not. Hesse was waiting in her rooms, and Hesse was not surprised, and that was the second door that opened onto the truth. You found it out, then, the old woman said, and rose, and did not reach for the pin, and did not fret. She looked, all at once, years younger and a great deal harder, as though a mask worn so long it had grown into the skin had finally been set down on a table. Good. It is past time? Sit, child. There are things I should have told you at your mother's grave, if you had ever been let near it. And Wenna, with her whole heart in pieces, sat, because Hesse was the one thing in her life that had never once been a lie, and she needed, that morning, one thing that had never been a lie. Hesse told her everything. She told it well. The way a woman tells a story she has rehearsed alone for 16 years. The winterborn queens, and the scent that no alpha could refuse, and the terror of the packs, who could not bear to be owned, and the long night of knives when the line was pulled up root and branch. She told of one servant of the last queen, young then, who had run through that night with a wailing infant under her cloak and a working of old iron at the child's throat to smother what the child was, so that no wolf on the roads would catch the scent and know. She told of 16 years of hiding a queen in a scullery, teaching her to be small, to be nothing, to be safe. She told of the last queen, of Wenna's own mother, who had been young and bright and had believed, right up until the end, that the Pax loved her. Because how could they not, when every alpha who came near her would have died at a single word from her mouth? She had never once given the word. That was the cruel joke of the Winterborn, Hesse said, that the good ones never used what they were, and the Pax murdered them all the same, because it is not the blow a frightened man cannot forgive. It is the knowing that the blow could fall at any moment and simply does not. She told of the night the high lords came with iron and with fire, of a queen who would not command her own killers to stop even to save her life, of a nursery window and a drop into deep snow, and a young warden running down a black road with a screaming child under her cloak, and a working of old craft pressed hard to its throat, to smother the scent before the wolves on the road could catch it and know what they had found. She told it beautifully. She had, after all, been telling it to herself in the dark for 16 years. I kept you alive, Hesse said. Every day of your life, I kept you alive. You kept me a maid, Wenna said. You told me the pin was for sickness. You forbade me my own face. Hesse, you let me believe I was nothing for 16 years, and you knew the whole time that I was. She could not finish it. A queen. Hesse's eyes shone. The last true queen the Pax have ever feared. And now, at last, the iron is failing, and you have been seen, and there is no putting it back. So there is only forward, and I have waited my whole life for forward. She leaned in, and her old hands closed on Wenna's, and her voice dropped to something fierce and tender and terrible all at once. Let it fail. Do not fight it any longer. Do not press your fingers to it in corridors. Let it come off before the whole high pack at the ruling and let them feel what you are. Every alpha in Rhymewood on his knees in the frost. Pharaoh Mark, the council, the boy king who lied to you. All of them kneeling and you standing, and no one ever again able to make you small. We take back what was stolen from your mother's line. You need never trust one of them again. You have me. You have always had me. Think of it. The old woman went on, softer now, sweeter, the very voice that had sung Wenna to sleep in a scullery cot. No more scrubbing, no more flinching when a lord turns his eye your way, no more being nothing at all. You were born the most powerful creature these lands have ever made, and I have kept you safe and whole and ready for this exact morning. And all you must do, child, all you have ever had to do, is let me show you how to use what you are. Have I not always known best? Have I ever once, in your whole life, led you wrong? It was the sweetest thing anyone had ever offered her, and Wenna sat very still inside it, and did the arithmetic. Because it was Hesse who had bound her, Hesse who had fixed her in a scullery, Hesse who had taught her, patiently every day to want nothing and expect nothing and be no one, and had called it love, and had meant, the whole time, this. A queen kept in a drawer until the day her keeper had a use for her. Alarin had learned what she was in a week and made her a plan, and it had been an ugly thing, and he had wept over it in his own careful way and buried it to keep her safe. Hessa had known what she was from the cradle, and spent 16 years making certain that when the day came, the most powerful being in the realm would not know how to do anything but reach for Hessa's hand. The one relationship in her whole life that had never been a lie was the longest lie of all. She understood, sitting there, that she had been useful to every soul who had ever claimed to love her. But only Hessa had planned it from the very start. She thought of every small cruelty dressed as care across 16 years. The gray, shut face Hessa made whenever Wenna asked about her mother, the face she had always taken for old grief and now understood was calculation, a keeper deciding again what her blade was ready to be told. The forbidding of the pin's removal, on pain of the worst punishment Hessa could put a name to, which a child takes for a nurse's fear, and which was a smith guarding the temper of the steel. The patient way Hessa had steered her, always away from anyone who might have wanted her for her own sake, toward corners and back stairs and invisibility, so that when the day at last arrived, there would be no one in the whole wide world Wenna trusted but the woman who held the iron. It was so complete. It was the unhurried work of a lifetime, and the lifetime it had cost had been Wenna's own, spent to the last coin. She did not let any of it show. 16 years of being nothing had taught her, at least, how to keep her face shut, and she used it now on the woman who had taught it to her. She let her shoulders soften, she let her eyes fill, which was not even a lie. All of them, kneeling, she said, as though she were only now letting herself want it. Tell me what I have to do. And Hessa, who had never once in 16 years been read by the girl she had raised, smiled and told her. The elder court reconvened at dusk to give its ruling, and the whole high pack came back to the great hall to hear it, and not one of them knew they had been called to a coronation. Hessa had dressed her herself, plain and gray, a warden and her ward, and had walked her in through the servants' door to stand at the foot of the high bench where the 9 elders sat. The plan was a simple one, and old, and patient. When the ruling was read, whichever way it fell, Wenna was to reach up and take the pin from her own throat, in her own hand, before the assembled pack, and let 16 years of failing iron finally fall, and let the packs of rimewood learn on their knees what had been living in their scullery. Hessa would stand at her shoulder and speak, and a kneeling hall does not argue with the voice beside the thing it is kneeling to. Alarin was on the dais. He looked as though he had not slept. He did not look at her, and she was fiercely glad of it, and fiercely something else she refused to name. The eldest of the 9 rose with the ruling in his hand. Bracken leaned forward. Izan watched with her cold gold patience. Doran stood among the Pharaohmark men with his eyes already fixed on Wenna, half remembering, all wanting. The hall was even fuller than it had been the night before. Word of the strange sickness that had swept the feast had run through Karsthal like fire through dry grass, and half the high pack had come less to hear a ruling than to see whether the thing would happen again, so that the great room was packed to its cold stone walls with the most powerful alphas in rimewood, shoulder to shoulder, every one of them an ember, and not a single one of them aware that he sat in a hall about to become a furnace. Wenna stood small and gray at the foot of the bench with her keeper at her shoulder, and her own heart going like a bird against a window, and she thought, with a calm that frightened her more than any fear would have, that Hessa had chosen the room well. If a person wished to show the packs a queen, she could not have built a better place to do it. The elder court has weighed the challenge, the old man began, and finds. Wenna reached up and took the pin from her throat. She did not wait for the ruling. That was the first thing that was hers, and not Hessa's, that she chose the moment. And it was a small thing, and it changed everything that came after. The little black clasp came away cold and dead in her fingers, its long work finished, and for one held breath, nothing happened at all. Then the winter came off her. There is no honest way to tell what filled the great hall of Karstal in that moment, because no one who felt it kept the words for it. It was scent, and it was more than scent. It was the presence of a thing the Pax had built their whole world to be rid of, walking back in through a servant's door, and every wolf in that hall felt it strike the oldest part of them, the part beneath thought, beneath rank, beneath even fear, the part that had knelt to the winter-born queens before there were kings at all. It was not desire, though it wore desire's shape in the younger ones. It was not fear, though the oldest of them felt it as fear. It was recognition. Every wolf in that hall, down to the last drop of the most ancient blood in them, knew her, the way a body knows the ground even after the mind has forgotten how to fall, and knew that a thing had come back into the world that all of them had been born already having lost to. There was nothing in an alpha with which to fight it. It reached past the crown and past the sword and past a whole lifetime of pride and closed its hand around the one knee in each of them that had never in all their lives been asked to bend, and it bent it. Bracken went down first, the old counselor folding to the stone as though his strings had been cut. Then the 9 of the elder court, one after another off their high bench. Then the lords in their midwinter furs, row upon row, a whole hall of the proudest alphas in Rhymewood sinking to their knees in the blazing light with their faces turned up to her, streaked, some of them, with tears they did not understand. Doran of Ferromark knelt with his forehead pressed to the floor. Isan, cold golden Isan, who had never in her life bent to a living soul, went down among the Ferromark silks with a sound like grief. 300 of the proudest creatures in the north went down into the rushes and the cold stone together, in a sound like a great slow wave drawing back off a beach, furs and silks and iron all folding to the floor at once, and where a moment before there had been the roar of a packed hall, there was now only breathing. 300 alphas breathing as one, faces lifted, waiting, turned up to the small gray woman at the foot of the bench. Like so many flowers turned up to a sun, they had spent their whole lives being told to hate. And on the dais, the king of Rhymewood came slowly to his knees like all the rest, his pale eyes wide and fixed on her. And for the first time since a hall like this one had sentenced her, Wenna stood over Alaron and looked down. The hall was hers. Every soul in it was hers, to the last breath, to do with entirely as she wished. Now, breathed Hessa at her shoulder, trembling with a joy 16 years in the making. Now, my queen, tell them the Winterborn have come back to Rhymewood, and tell them who to thank for it, and tell them what they are to do. Her old hand closed on Wenna's arm, guiding, aiming, the way it had aimed her whole life. Speak, and I will tell you the words. And Wenna, standing in the one moment her keeper had built a lifetime toward, turned her head and looked at the kneeling hall and did not say any of Hessa's words. Rise if you can, she said instead, to all of them. And her voice carried into every corner because there was not a creature there who could help but hear it. I know you cannot. I know exactly what is holding you down, because it held my mother's enemies down before you were born. And I am only now learning its name myself. So before I let you up, and I am going to let you up, I want you to hear one thing while you cannot look away from me, because you will spend the rest of your lives pretending you did not. She lifted the dead black pin so the hall could see it. This was put at my throat the night my mother's line was murdered, by the woman standing at my shoulder. She has told you, or will, that she saved me. She did. And then she kept me. 16 years in your kitchens, learning to be nothing, so that on the day the iron failed, I would not know how to do anything but hand this hall to her. She heard Hessa's breath stop. She did not turn. She raised a queen the way a man raises a blade, edge kept dull in the dark until the morning he means to draw it. She called it love. She is very good. She nearly had me believing, even this morning, that she was the last person alive who had never used me. Lies, Hessa said, and her voice cracked out over the kneeling hall, high and desperate. She is overwrought. She does not know what she says. She has been poisoned against me by the very king who deceived her. Do not listen. But a hall on its knees to Wenna could not have listened to another living voice if the roof had come down on them, and the old woman heard her own words fall into that vast attentive silence and go nowhere and stop. For the first time in 16 years Hessa had spoken and no one had obeyed. Wenna watched the understanding reach her, and watched what it did to her face, and found she took no pleasure in it at all, which was itself a kind of freedom. Now she turned and looked at Hessa, and Hessa's face was a ruin, because the one thing the old woman had never once planned for in 16 patient years was to be read by the girl she had made unreadable. You taught me to keep my face shut, Wenna said softly, only for her, though the silent hall drank every word. You should not have taught me so well. Hessa moved, quick for an old woman, snatching for the dead pin as though the iron could still be made to serve, as though she might yet fix her blade before it turned. But there were hands for her now. Two of the kneeling guards nearest the dais dragged themselves up by will alone against the weight of Wenna's presence, because a queen had, without meaning to, wanted them to, and they took the old warden gently by the arms, and Hessa did not fight them. She only looked at Wenna, and what was in her face was not hatred. It was the far worse thing. It was a mother watching a plan she had loved more than the child walk out of her hands forever. Take her somewhere warm, Wenna said. She is old, and she did save my life, and I have not decided yet what a queen does about a thing like that. But take her out of this hall. They took her out. The great doors closed, and Wenna was left standing over the whole kneeling high pack of rimewood, with the winter pouring off her and absolute power, the oldest and most terrible power the packs had ever known, gathered in her two plain hands. She could feel how easy it would be. That was the part no one ever warned her of. Not Hessa, not anyone. How easy. She could open her mouth and tell these lords to give her pharaoh mark, and they would ride for it at dawn. She could tell the 9 of the elder court to strike Alaron's name off every roll in the realm, and they would weep while they did it. She could tell the whole kneeling world to build the Winterborn back higher than they had ever stood. And no living alpha could refuse her a single word of it. And some cold, bright part of her that had scrubbed floors for 16 invisible years wanted it. Wanted it so badly her hands shook. And she let herself want it, for one long, honest moment, because she thought she owed the wanting that much truth. She thought of 16 years of yes, sir, and at once, sir, and right away, sir, of standing 8 hours on a flagstone, she had scrubbed herself at dawn, of being looked straight through by lords who would now crawl to her across that very floor. She thought of how good it would feel, how earned, how just. No one in the hall could have told her she had not earned it. That was exactly the trouble. There was no one left in the whole world who could tell her no, and she understood, standing there, that this was the reason she must not let herself take it. A thing that no one can refuse you is not a gift, and it is not a victory. It is only the oldest cruelty there is, wearing a finer crown. She looked down at all of them on their knees. Bracken, who had called her madness dressed as spite. Doran, who had backed her to a wall. Isan, gold and proud and weeping on the stone, and Alaron, who had lied to her and guarded her and knelt now like all the rest with his face turned up and open, waiting, she understood, not to be spared. He, of all of them, knew exactly what she was holding. He was waiting to see what she would do with it, the way a man waits to learn whether the thing he loves is also the thing he should have feared. And Wenna found, looking at a whole world that could not tell her no, that she did not want a single thing that was taken from a creature who had no way to refuse. "Get up," she said, and she let them go. She felt it leave her the way she chose it, drawing the winter back in, banking it like a fire, an act of will she had not known until that moment she possessed. All across the hall the weight lifted. The alphas of Rhymewood came shuddering back into themselves, gasping, staring, hauling one another to their feet, looking at her now with something that would in time become the thing kings are built on, which is not love and is not even fear, but the memory of having knelt and been allowed to rise. She was not a maid any longer. She was not a spited king's tantrum or a warden's blade, or the useful quiet thing at the edge of a great person's plans. She stood in the center of the great hall of Karsthal, and every alpha in the High Pack knew, now, exactly what she was, and exactly that she had held them and chosen to open her hand, and there was no one left in all of Rhymewood who ranked above her, the king of it least of all. He came to her through the milling, shaken hall, and he stopped a careful pace away, the way he had stopped in her rooms on the first night, when the distance had been a courtesy. It was not a courtesy now. It was a man who understood he no longer had any standing to close it. "Wenna," he said. "I know you kept my secret," she said, before he could go further, because she had promised herself she would say it and mean it. "I know it cost you. I have thought about very little else, and it does not mend it, Alaran. You learned what I was and you decided, all by yourself, in a locked drawer, what was safe for me to know about my own blood. You kept me small to keep me safe, exactly as she did. Only your eyes were kinder while you did it. I have just spent one whole winter and one whole life before it, being managed by people who loved me. I am done being managed, even gently, even by you." He flinched, but he did not argue, and she loved him for not arguing, and hated that she still could. "You are right," he said, "about all of it. I usually am. No one ever listened before." She stepped past him. At the great doors she stopped, and looked back at the king kneeling to her still in every way that was not his knees, and she gave him the only honest thing she had left. "I am going to go and find out who I am, now that no one is holding the iron. Do not come after me to keep me safe. If you ever want to find me again, come with your hands open and nothing in them, and we will see." And the last of the Winterborn walked out of the hall that had made her a queen twice over, once by spite and once by her own hand, and this time she did not pass out. And this time she heard every word, because this time all the words were her own. He did not come after her to keep her safe. That, in the end, was how she knew. She had gone north, past the last of Rhymewood's walls, to the high, cold country where the Winterborn had kept their oldest hall before the Night of Knives, because Garrick, who turned out to be a better man than his orders, had quietly found for her everything the king's inquiry had ever learned, and given it into her own hands, and asked her forgiveness for the watching, and gone home. She had spent the deep of the winter there, in a stone house with a hard, clean light, reading her mother's line back into herself one page at a time, learning the names of women who had commanded packs and, the good ones, had chosen not to. She was not a maid and she was not a weapon. She was the last of something and she was making up, out of old pages and hard mornings, what that was going to mean. Pell had come north with her, because Pell had announced that a queen who could level a hall with a sneeze still could not braid her own hair to save her life, and someone sensible had to stay. It was nearly the only company Wenna kept that whole winter, and it was enough, and it was chosen, and that too was a thing she was learning the taste of. And on an ordinary day near the first thaw, She looked up from the frozen yard, and the king of Rimewood was standing at her gate with his hands open and nothing in them. He had come alone, which for a king is its own kind of nakedness. He had left the crown at Carstall. He had, she would learn, done a number of things over the winter that a clever man securing a weapon would never dream of doing. He had stood before his own council and the 9 of the elder court and the envoys of Pharaohmark, and told them, plainly, what she was, and told them in the same breath that Rimewood renounced forever any claim to use her, and that any pack that reached for the Winterborn as a blade would find Rimewood between them and her. He had taken the one secret that could have made him the most secure king in 5 generations and set it on fire in front of the very people he had once meant to keep it from, and made himself, in the doing, a good deal less safe and a great deal more honest. "You told them," she said from her own doorway. She did not go to the gate. Not yet. "I told them everything." His breath smoked in the cold. "It seemed only fair, since you had to learn it from a drawer. I found I did not want to be a man who kept you safe by keeping you small. You said the words to me in the hall, and I have not been able to put them down since." "And the marriage?" "Struck from the rolls at last. The court found it was begun in spite and never made true, and for once, the court was right." Something that was almost the old dryness touched his mouth. "You are no longer married to me, Wenna. You are not bound to Rimewood, or to me, by spite or by iron or by anything at all. There is not one thing left holding you to this gate but whatever you decide to want." The thaw dripped from the eaves between them. Somewhere off in the white hills a first bird tried out the idea of spring. "You came with your hands open," she said. "You told me to. I told you to come only if you wanted to find me again. I know what you told me." And now the careful king was gone entirely, and the man who had brushed the hair from her forehead in a dark passage stood shivering at her gate with his whole heart in his open hands. "I have been the king of Rimewood for a year and some, and I have learned that a crown is only a way of being obeyed by people who do not mean it." And then a scullery girl stood on a chair of my making and told me the truth to my face, when every other soul in my kingdom would only bow, and I have not had a single honest hour since she walked out of my hall that I did not spend wishing she would walk back into it. "I did not come to keep you safe, Wenna. You do not need me for that. There is not a creature alive who can make you kneel. I came because I would rather be told the truth by you for the rest of my life than be lied to comfortably by anyone else for the rest of it. That is all I have. I know it is not much to a queen." Wenna the maid had waited her whole life to be wanted and had learned, the hard way, in a locked study, exactly what it cost to be wanted for use. And Wenna the queen, who could have had the whole kneeling world and had handed it back, stood in her own doorway in the first thaw, and understood the difference at last between a man who wanted what she could do and a man who had set the whole of it on fire and come to her gate with nothing, so that whatever she chose would be a thing she chose, and not a thing she was made to do. She came down across the frozen yard. He watched her come the way the hall had watched her, as though at any moment he might have to learn to breathe again. "You are going to be difficult," she said, stopping in front of him. "You knowing my worst and me knowing yours. There will be no comfortable lies at all." "None," he agreed. "It sounds unbearable." "It sounds," said Wenna, "like the only thing I have ever wanted." And she took his open hands in both of hers, which was a thing no one in the world could have made her do, and closed them. They were married in the thaw, in the high cold country, with no council and no envoys and no crown, only Pell weeping cheerfully into a handful of early flowers, and Garrick standing witness and looking, for the first time in 3 kings' service, as though he approved of something. She wore no pin at her throat. She would never wear one again, And when the old words were said and it was done, Alaron, who had married her once to spite the world, and once could not have stopped the world if it tried, leaned his forehead to hers and said, "Lo, only for her. You could have had all of them, you know that. You had the whole pack on its knees and you walked out the door." "I did," said Wenna. "Why?" "Because a thing you take from someone who cannot say no," she told him, "is never once, in all your life, worth as much as a thing that is freely given. I learned that from a very good teacher. She meant me to learn the opposite." She smiled, and it reached all the way up, which it had not done the whole long winter. "Now be quiet and kiss your queen, your grace. For once in your life, you may consider it an order." He did, gladly, and for once in her life, she was giving them, and neither of them, that day, missed the crown at all. So there it is. If you want to lay the blame for all of it somewhere, you may still lay it, as we began, at the feet of a proud young king who could not bear to be told what to do. But I have always thought the fault was the frosts, for coming late enough that two stubborn people ran out of lies before they ran out of winter.